All right, well, hello to our friends joining us via recording. We are going to be talking today about the various actions that muscles in the body do. We're going to talk about how we can use the locations of our muscles to predict what movements they do, which will help us out a lot since we have a lot of other things we need to be memorizing for the midterm exam. So let me get my pen, try to write on the screen for us here. All right, today we are going to talk about movements of various muscles in the body, and whenever we talk about movements, they always happen around a joint. So joints are places where two bones come together. Most of the joints that you're learning this semester, their name just comes from the two bones that come together at those locations. So for example, when we look at this joint right here that's called the femoropatellar joint, I can see that the two bones at this joint are the femur and the patella. Or if I go down here, we've got the tibiofemoral joint. That's the tibia and the femur. So most of the joints in the body get their name either from the two bones that come together at a place, or when we look at something like this one right here, the glenohumeral joint, this tells me the name of a bone marking that's at that joint as well as a bone. So the gleno part of its name comes from the glenoid cavity, which is an indentation on the scapula, and the humeral part obviously comes from the humerus. So when we talk about joints today, we are going to start here at the hips. We're going to start at what's called the coxal joint, your hip joint, and then we're going to work our way down. So we'll talk about movements at the knee joints. There are multiple joints in the knee, as we can kind of see from our list. So the place where the femur interacts with the patella, that's the one called the femoropatellar joint. Where the femur interacts with the tibia in the leg, that is the tibiofemoral joint. Down at the bottom of the leg, another joint we're going to talk about today is this one right here called the tibiotarsal joint. The tarsal bones are the bones that make up your ankle at the back. So in particular, the one that your tibia is articulating with is called the talus. So the tibia sits on top of the talus, and that's what makes your ankle joint. So we're going to start by looking at the joints of the leg. Then we're going to go back up to our shoulder. Lost my little pointer. There we go. Back up to the shoulder, where we're going to start with the glenohumeral joint in the top of the shoulder. Then we've got two joints that make up the elbow. And you actually had this on your group work activity to remind you that there are two different bones that articulate with the humerus at the elbow joint. So when we're on the thumb side, that's this outside out here. When we're on the thumb side, that's where we find the radius. So the humeroradial joint is the joint that's on the outside. The humeroulnar joint is the one that's on the ulna side, on the pinky side. Two joints that make up your elbow. Again, those joints are named exactly based on the bones that come together at that location. So that should help us out. The only other joints that we did not talk about are that we're going to be talking about movement at today is the one down here. This one down here is called the distal radioulnar joint. This is one of my joints in my arm right down by the wrist. So the radius and the ulna articulate with each other down by your wrist, down by the carpal bones that are there as well. So these are the majority of the joints that we're going to be talking about today. Keep those fresh in your mind as we start talking about movements. Before we dive into specific movements at specific joints, I need you to remember what some of these movement words mean, because that's going to be really important for us as we're predicting actions. So the first set of movement words that we need to make sure that we remember and we can define are called flexion and extension. When we talk about flexing something, the technical definition of it is that we decrease the angle that's seen at the joint. But maybe an easier way to consider what flexion is thinking about how we bring two bones together. So any movement that is a flexion movement, my two bones are going to move closer together, my two bones that come together at that joint. Extension is the opposite of flexion. And when we do extension, we're technically increasing the angle at the joint. Or again, an easier way to think about this might be that we're pushing our bones apart. So any movement that moves two bones away from each other at the joint, we'd call that extension. Any movement that brings the bones together at a joint, that would be considered flexion. So many of the movements we're predicting today are just flexion or extension. Are we bringing things closer together or farther apart? The other main movement we're going to be predicting today is abduction and adduction. And when we talk about these two movements, it's all about the midline of the body, the middle of your body. Or in the case of the wrist, when we're talking about movements of the wrist, kind of moving it up and away from your middle finger compared to toward or into the middle of your middle finger. So abduction is like when the aliens abduct you and they pull you away from Earth. So we can abduct the shoulder when your arms go up to the side, or abduct the hip when your leg goes outward. Adduction is when we move things back toward the middle of the body, or we're adding them back. The way I want you to approach these muscle movement activities that we have to learn is I really want you to make sure that you know what the movements look like. Meaning, if I tell you that this muscle does flexion, I care more that you know what flexion looks like than you know the exact muscle I'm talking about. So the approach we're going to take is we're talking about these different movements at different joints, is I'm going to show you on my slides what a movement looks like. We're all at home, we're in a virtual environment, and nobody has their camera on, so nobody can see you. I always tell my students, I need you to act these things out. So when I tell you what flexion looks like, please do it on yourself. If you can feel what flexion looks like and we can see the way the movement works, it's going to help us predict what muscles are doing that. So with that in mind, let's dive into our first set of movements. We are starting at the coxal joint. Remember that the coxal joint is the hip joint. When we talk about the coxal joint, it can do a variety of different movements, but the first movement we're going to do is flexion and extension. When we think about flexing the coxal joint, we start with a consideration of anatomical position. Now, neither of my skeletons are technically an anatomical position, but what anatomical position is when you're standing up straight, your feet are facing forward, your palms are facing forward. Flexion from anatomical position is when we pull our femur forward. Lost my pointer. There we go. Okay. Pulling the femur forward is flexion, making the femur come closer to the front of the body. We're bringing together this femur bone with the front of the hip. That's flexion of the femur. So my skeleton over here who's in motion, we can consider and see how flexion of the femur is going to pull it forward back to where it's closer to the hip bones. Flexion at the coxal joint, where we bring the femur closer to the hip bones, that brings the femur forward. When we talk about extension at the coxal joint, extension makes the angle bigger between them. It pulls them farther apart. So the reason I included my friend here in motion is because we can see that anatomical position for his leg, his femur would be back down here. Right now, he's pretty close to the pelvis. So if I move this femur back toward anatomical position, I am extending it. I'm making the angle between them larger. So extension is when we pull the femur backwards. Flexion is when we pull the femur forwards. Flexion and extension at the coxal joint, at the hip joint. The reason I want you to make sure you know what those movements feel like is because when I ask you who does what, the side that the femur is moving toward is going to tell me the kinds of muscles that must be doing that movement. So remember that we said that flexion pulls the femur forward. Notice that most of the muscles that are doing flexion live on the front side of the thigh. So this is going to be muscles. We've got our big one here in the middle. This big one in the middle is rectus femoris. This is going to be muscles like my one here that goes down at an angle. That's called sartorius. Muscles, my vastus muscles, these two ones right here. These ones that live here on the front, when they contract, they pull the femur forward. They pull it toward themselves. So if I'm a muscle and I live on the front of the thigh, I pull the femur forward at the hip joint. That group of muscles, the ones that live on the front, that one's really easy for us to just consider, oh, the femur is moving forward. So if I live on the front, I do that. Awesome. That's not hard to memorize. What might be a little bit harder to memorize, so you just need to consciously memorize this part, is that if you live on the medial side of the thigh as well, so if you're somebody like the adductor group right here, the adductor group, you also help to pull the femur forward. When we talk about doing that movement of extension, which is pulling the femur backwards, when we do extension, the muscles that help us to do that are the muscles that live on the posterior side. If I'm pulling the femur posterior, I must live on the back side. So this is going to be some of those muscles that we see on the back. Muscles like biceps femoris on the outside, semitendinosus that I find next to biceps femoris. You have semimembranosus listed in your packet as well. That's the little tiny muscle that lives next to semitendinosus. So it's another one there on the back. Big picture, let's summarize what we've said so far. So far, we've said that flexion looks like moving the femur forward. At the coxal joint, flexion means I pull the femur forward. Extension means I pull it backwards. That's the first thing we need to know. What does it look like? Because if I know that, I know that the muscles that live on the front of the thigh pull the thigh forward, and the muscles that live on the back pull the thigh backwards. It's really important for us to know where our muscles are found. I tell my students really the two things with muscles that we need to memorize. Number one, we need to memorize where they are. So we got to know our muscle man inside and out. I know we hate him because he's not in anatomical position, but we have to know our muscles on him. Are they on the front? Are they on the back? I need to know where they're found. That's number one. Number two, I need to know what my movements look like. Because if I know who lives where and I know what my movement looks like, I don't have to memorize at all who does what. Those are just prediction questions. If you can learn where the muscles live and you can learn what the movements look like, on the final exam, you can predict those movements. I give you the name of a muscle. As long as you know if it's on the front or the back, you can tell me if it flexes or extends. You don't even have to have the specific muscles memorized. So please try to consider it in that way. Don't memorize the specific actions of specific muscles. Learn them in groups. Learn them in locations. I see the question in the chat that asked me who my two semi-muscles were. So I'll type it for you and also say it. The one that we have labeled in lab is semitendinosus. The other one is called semimembranosus. That is a muscle that shows up on your page where you're predicting the actions of muscles. So semimembranosus, we're never going to ask you to label it, but you should know it's on the back side, so it helps us to do extension. Let me pause for a moment. I've talked a lot. Do we have any questions that we want to put in the chat? Or if we don't have any questions, can you send me a thumbs up so I know you're tracking with me? Okay, so I have a question about gluteus. When we talk about gluteus, we're only going to ask you about gluteus maximus when we're talking about these movements. So gluteus maximus is right here. Would we consider that gluteus maximus is on the front or the back of the leg? What do we think about gluteus? Is that on the front or the back of the leg? Anyone can answer that, not just Courtney. Yeah, so we're going to consider that the gluteus is on the back of the leg, which means that the gluteus is going to pull the femur backwards. The gluteus is going to do extension. So let me see my other questions here. So Tommy asked about the extensor longus muscle. That muscle works at a different joint. We're going to get to that one. Right now, we're just talking about movements at the coxal joint, at the hip joint. So extensor longus coming soon. Yeah, so muscles that live on the front side of the femur pull the femur forward. That is correct. And that movement is called flexion. Muscles that live on the back side of the femur pull the femur backwards, and that movement is called extension. So Ethel, 100% correct, what you had written there. All right, so we have done our first joint where we talked about moving forward and moving backwards. We talked about flexion and extension. The other movement that happens at the coxal joint is abduction and adduction. And remember that these terms meant that we're either moving with abduction away from the midline, or with adduction, we're moving toward the midline. So when we go back to our hip joint, here's the hip joint right here. When I talk about doing abduction, in abduction, my femur goes up. Abduction, we're pulling it away from the middle of the body. In adduction, we're adding it back to the middle. Adduction, we move it back toward the middle. So again, you're at home, no one can see you. Please do this, and maybe even if you're not too weirded out by it, say out loud when you're doing the movements that moving your thigh out is abduction, moving it back in is adduction. Here's what those movements look like. That's the first thing we need to know. Abduction, moving out. Adduction, moving in. Now that we know that, let's look at our rules. Our rules say that if you live on the lateral side of the leg, you do abduction. Hey, check it out. When we talked about what abduction looks like, the femur does move laterally. So if I'm moving my femur laterally, I must live on the lateral side. If we're talking about adduction, where I'm pulling the femur back to the middle, if I pull the femur back to the middle, I must live on the medial side. So when we're making predictions about these kinds of muscles, some of the muscles that we have you make this prediction on are things like gluteus medius, that lives here on the lateral side of the hip. If I contract, I'm pulling the femur laterally. I'm doing abduction. Compare that to muscles like the adductor. To be fair, that muscle's name really helps us out, right? It tells us that it does adduction. But if I didn't know that its name told me what it did, it lives on the medial side of the thigh, so it's going to pull the thigh medially. Or we've got this long, skinny muscle that's here in the middle of the thigh. That's the muscle called gracilis. It's found medially, so gracilis is going to help me with adduction, pulling things back together. So remember Dr. Hollis's study tip. If I know what the movement looks like, in this case, are we moving laterally or medially? And if I know where everybody lives, I can make these predictions. Abductor muscles live on the lateral side of the femur because that's the way the femur moves when I do abduction. Adductor muscles live on the medial side of the femur. They pull the femur medially, which is called adduction. So we've talked about the two movements that we can do at the coxal joint, the two movements that we do up here at the hip. The muscles that live on the thigh not only move the hip joint, but they also move the tibiofemoral joint, the tibiofemoral joint. So now we're going from talking about the hip to talking about the knee. Now we're into the knee joint. At the tibiofemoral joint, at the knee joint, this is where it's really important that you know what these movement words look like, because things are a little bit funky at the knee joint. When we talk about the knee joint, I can see, remember our definition was we have this angle between the bones at the knee joint. When I pull the tibia backwards, when I'm pulling it closer to the femur, that's the movement called flexion. Flexion is when two bones come together. So if you're sitting down like I am, you've got your knee hanging down. When you pull your shin back toward your femur, when the femur move or when the tibia moves toward the back side, that is flexion. At the knee joint, flexion looks like moving backwards. At the knee joint, the way that I make this angle bigger, separate the femur and the tibia, is I move the tibia forward. At the knee joint, extension looks like the knee moving forward. We may or may not be catching this. Let me just to clarify, to make sure we're on the same page. Earlier, we talked about the hip joint. At the hip joint, when I flexed the femur, that made the femur come forward. Now, at the knee joint, when I flex the tibia goes backwards. These two joints are opposite of each other. This is why it's really important that you know what the movements feel like. So you flex your femur up, you flex your tibia backwards. We extend the femur toward the back side of the body. When we extend the tibia, we're actually pulling it forward. So check this out. We go back to those rules about where you live, telling me what you do. Remember that, that extending the tibia looks like pulling the tibia forward. Here's extending the tibia. If you extend the tibia, you live on the front. So all of those muscles up here that we had said flexed the femur, these guys all extend the tibia. And when we're talking about flexing the tibia, These are the muscles that live on the back side because flexing the tibia looks like this. So if you flex the tibia, you are one of the muscles that lives back here. Muscles on the back side of the thigh flex the tibia. They bring the tibia closer to the femur. Muscles on the front side of the thigh extend the tibia. They pull it away from the femur. What questions or thoughts do we have about this? The knee joint or the tibiofemoral joint? Or shoot me an emoji. I'll help us out with the emoji train so that we're not afraid to send weird things. Dr. Ollis loves penguins. Here's my penguin. Awesome. I got a cat. I like it. Yay, another penguin. Love it. Yeah, so Ethel is clarifying if you flex the tibia, you live on the back. If you extend the tibia, you live on the front. That is correct. Yes. Oh yeah, so Tommy's asking where the emojis are. There should be a little smiley face underneath where you see type a message. If you click on that, it should let you send emojis, and they got all kinds of emojis. Courtney's doing the face palm. Care to elaborate, Courtney, or does that mean your head hurts? Yeah, so she asked if kicking is extension. That is correct. When you kick a ball, you are extending the tibia. Yeah, that's a great way to think about it. So kicking a ball is extending the tibia. They have those things when you're doing high intensity exercise called butt kicks, where you kick your own butt, literally. That would be flexion. So kicking a ball forward, extension, kicking yourself is flexion on the back. Great correlation to make. Absolutely. Okay, so we have done the hip joint, moving the femur forward and backwards, moving it lateral and medial. We have done the knee joint. At the knee joint, we can only go forward and backwards. Now we're going to go down to the ankle joint. At the ankle joint, the names of the movements that I do are a little bit weird. So these are just movements that I want you to memorize what they look like because their names don't help me out quite as much. At the ankle joint, so the tibiotarsal joint, we can do the movements dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. Dorsiflexion is when you move your toes toward the dorsal side of your body. Dorsiflexion. Plantar flexion is when you stand on your tiptoes, when you move the tiptoes toward the plantar region, which is the bottom of your foot. So dorsiflexion, if I'm pulling the toes toward the back of my body, the toes are moving in the direction of the front side of my foot. They're moving toward the front side of my thigh. When I'm doing plantar flexion, my toes are moving toward the back side of my body. So when I look at this, we talk about dorsiflexion. Dorsiflexion, when you're pulling those toes and they're coming closer to the front side of your tibia up here. If you live on the front and you pull on the feet bones, you're doing dorsiflexion. Anterior muscles help with dorsiflexion. Oh, I forgot to excuse my typo right here. This is supposed to say plantar flexion, okay? If I live on the back side of the foot and I contract and start pulling on the foot, I'm going to pull that foot toward me on the back, which is what you do when you're in tiptoes. So when we're on our tiptoes, that's muscles on the posterior side of the leg. Things like gastrocnemius or soleus. When we're talking about doing dorsiflexion, muscles like tibialis anterior that lives on the front, muscles like extensor digitorum longus that live on the front. When they pull on the foot, they make the foot do dorsiflexion. If you live on the back and you pull on the foot, you do plantar flexion. So the last joint of the leg, the ankle joint, the tibiotarsal joint. Again, if you know what dorsiflexion looks like and you know what plantar flexion looks like, you can predict these rules. You don't even have to memorize the rules. We got to memorize who lives where. We got to memorize what the movements look like. That's it. Everything else is predictions. All right. We're going to switch gears. Although if you have questions, as always, please feel free to put them in the chat. I'm happy to go back to stuff. I'm going to take us up to the shoulder joint now. Now we're going to work our way through the arm. So remember that the glenohumeral joint is the shoulder joint. It gets its name because of the glenoid cavity that's at the top, or that's at the side, excuse me, of the scapula, and the humerus going into that joint. When we're at the glenohumeral joint, just like at the coxal joint, we do flexion and extension, and we do abduction and adduction. So 2 sets of movements we're going to talk about here. Let me check really fast. I see that Ethel asked me. So yeah, so dorsiflexion is when your toes move, kind of toward the backside of your body, or a good way to think about it is if you're rocking on your heels, that's dorsiflexion. Plantar flexion is when we stand on our tiptoes. So our toes technically are moving toward the back, the direction they're moving. If you go from flat to on your tiptoes, the toes move closer to the back. On dorsiflexion, we are rocking, our whole foot is moving up and backwards. It's a kind of a tough distinction to make between moving toward the back versus not moving toward the back. The best way to describe dorsiflexion and plantar flexion: rocking back on your heels, dorsiflexion; standing on your tiptoes, plantar flexion. If you can think about it that way, it might eliminate a little bit of the confusion in terms of backside, front side, what are we even saying, right? With the ankle joint, it's a little bit weird like that. Plantar flexion, by the way, is what ladies do when they wear heels. So, you know, gastrocnemius, the muscle on the back side of the leg, that's what you're showing off when you wear a pair of heels. So gastrocnemius helps you to do plantar flexion because we show it off in a pair of high heels. Any other questions? I should have paused. I apologize before I jumped into the shoulder. Or do I have any emojis that we want to express? I haven't played around as much with Teams, but here we go. This is a fun one. Nice. Lots of thumbs up. I sent in the muscle arm because we're about to, not quite, but about to talk about flexing that bicep. All right, so let's talk about the shoulder. Oh, nice. So Leela found us a leg. We just finished the leg. That's perfect. So act out those movements of the joints of your leg. Use what those movements look like to help you predict those actions. When we talk about the shoulder joints, the glenohumeral joints, the good news is this is going to be a lot like the hip joint was. So when I flex, my humerus goes forwards. When I flex at the glenohumeral joint, the humerus is pulled forward. When I do extension at the glenohumeral joint, the humerus is pulled backwards. So over here on my friend in motion, when I pull that arm back down toward anatomical position, that is extension. When I pull this arm back toward anatomical position, that is flexion. So when we're looking at our rules for the movements of the humerus, if you live on the front side of the arm, so that's going to be, oh, and I should clarify here, the muscles that are moving the humerus actually live on the trunk. They live on the thorax. So this is going to be things like pectoralis. This is going to be things like serratus that are on the front. They attach to the humerus and pull the humerus forward. Deltoid muscle as well up here. All these guys attach on the front and they pull the humerus forward. When we're talking about moving the humerus backwards, the muscles that attach on the back side of the humerus make that happen. So a big one that we talked about is latissimus dorsi. Latissimus dorsi goes all the way up and attaches to the humerus. It pulls on the humerus and pulls it backwards. I believe that we also ask you about the teres helping us. So this is teres major. This big, well, I say big, but it's not that big. There's the bigger teres major, and we didn't ask you about teres minor, but that's the smaller one right there. So when we're moving the humerus, moving your whole arm forward or backwards, that's the job of muscles that attach to your trunk. They're the only ones that can move the humerus forward or backwards. If you live on the front side, you pull the humerus forward. That's flexion. If you live on the back side, you pull the humerus backwards. That's extension. Flexion and extension at the glenohumeral joint. Just like the coxal joint, we can also do abduction and adduction here. So abduction, when we pull the humerus out, the aliens are abducting you. Adduction, when we pull the humerus back in toward the middle. So when we look at our rules for abduction and adduction, it's exactly the same. So if you attach to the lateral side of the humerus, so my big one here being the deltoid muscle on top of the shoulder, that's my major abductor. When it contracts, it pulls the whole arm up. Deltoid muscle, major abductor. Some of my major adductors, again, that latissimus muscle that we talked about. I keep losing my pointer. There we go. Okay. The latissimus muscle is one of my big adductors, pulling it back down into place. But all my friends who live on the back side are also able to pull it back toward the midline of the body. So if you're on the outside, you pull the bone outside. If you're on the inside, you pull the bone inside. These are our movements at the glenohumeral joint. Flexion, extension, abduction, adduction. Questions? So we have a question about trapezius. I don't believe we asked you to predict that one. Is that correct? Trapezius, to my knowledge, doesn't actually reach all the way out to the humerus. I'm shuffling through my papers here. Don't want to steer you wrong. Can anyone help me out? So sorry. Here we go. I finally found the arm. Yeah, so Leela asked about the deltoid. The deltoid does abduct and it also flexes. That is correct. Okay, so if we are making predictions on trapezius, I have an old lab manual that is here at home with me. But if we do ask you to make predictions about trapezius, let's use our rules that we've talked about. So when we're talking about trapezius is on the back side of the body. So if we're on the back side of the body, we're going to pull trapezius backwards, which means we're going to pull the humerus backwards, which means we are extending. And if trapezius is pulling the humerus, trapezius is closer to the middle of the body than the humerus is. So trapezius is also going to adduct the humerus. Again, I can't remember if we asked you to make all of those predictions, but if we do, use your rules. It's going to be an extender and an adductor. All right, so checking our statement here. When I flex my humerus, the humerus is pulled forward. That is correct. So if you live on the front, you do flexion. And yeah, if we extend our humerus, it goes backwards. And for you to be able to move it backwards, you got to live on the backside. That is absolutely correct. Great summary. All right, so the glenohumeral joint, the shoulder joint, we go forward and backwards. We go medially and laterally. That's the shoulder joint. Then we get to the elbow joint. When we talk about the elbow joint, we can only do flexion and extension. That's good for us. We only have to do flexion and extension. So when we are at the elbow joint, flexion, and now we're talking about moving the radius and the ulna. So at the elbow joint, the radius and the ulna move. Flexing the radius and the ulna brings them closer to the humerus. Flexion brings them closer together, which means, as you can do at home, flexion, when you bring them closer together, we're moving them anteriorly. If you go from arms straight down to pulling them closer together, we're moving it anteriorly. When we extend this joint to get it as big as possible, we are moving posteriorly. We're moving toward the back. So flexing, we'll go over to my skeleton who is closer to anatomical position. Flexing, the elbow joint goes forward. Extending the elbow joint is what gets you back to anatomical position. Because flexion looks like pulling the radius and the ulna forward, that's where my muscles live that do this. So if you live on the front, which when we're talking about moving the radius and ulna, now we're talking about our muscles that live right here. So biceps brachii and brachioradialis, these are our two big flexors for the radius and the ulna. Biceps brachii is this one right here. Brachioradialis, I'm going to color over it. It's this one right here. Brachioradialis. They both live on the front. These are flexors at the elbow joint. Oh, I may have mixed that up. Ignore that last. I will find you brachioradialis better. I believe I don't think that's actually brachioradialis because that's the backside of the arm. Muscle man strikes again. So biceps brachii and brachioradialis do both do flexion. When we talk about extension at the elbow joint, what helps us with extension, the big one is triceps brachii. So triceps brachii back here on the back side of the arm, that's my major extensor at the elbow joint. Biceps does flexion. Triceps on the back side does extension. Elbow joint. Last arm joint is the wrist. So the wrist joint, we can flex it and extend it. And actually one of a new movement that we can do is also called hyperextension. When we do hyperextension, we actually go farther behind than anatomical position. So remember that in anatomical position, your palms are facing forward. When I flex at the wrist joint, I am pulling my hand closer to the radius and the ulna, flexing it. So when you bring your hand up, flexing it. When I bring my hand back to anatomical position, or even behind anatomical position, like if I'm carrying a tray at a restaurant, right? I'm wait staff and I'm carrying a tray. That is extension. So we go over to our friend here on the side. We've got flexion going forward, extension going backwards. And our rules, as we look at them, are going to tell us exactly what we think they will. If I live on the back side, which is the way that the hand moves when I do extension, I'm going to help with extension. If I live on the front side, I'm going to pull the hand forward. And pulling the hand forward is flexion. When we talk about moving the wrist, the muscles who move the wrist are found in the forearm. So all of these muscles here are my wrist movers. And all of these muscles that I see here are my wrist movers. When you're identifying the muscles that we see on the forearm, I tell my students there's only two that you have to memorize. The two that you have to memorize, because we can predict our others. Here's the first one that we have to memorize. This one right here with the tendon that goes all the way into the hand. This one down here is called palmaris longus. We got to know palmaris longus. If you can identify palmaris longus, which is the muscle on the front of the hand that goes all the way down into the palm, the muscles that live on either side of it are going to be the flexors that are named based on the bone that they're next to. So over here, we're on the thumb side. I know it's hard to see, but here's the little thumb. So this is going to be flexor carpi radialis. Flexor carpi radialis. I don't have to memorize this muscle though. I do have to memorize palmaris. I got to know where palmaris is. But on the radius side, right next door to palmaris, is flexor carpi radialis. On the other side is flexor carpi ulnaris, because it's on the ulna side. Again, we don't have to memorize these two. If we know where palmaris longus is, we can predict the location of its neighbors. It's the same deal when we are talking about muscles on the back side of the arm. The one that we have to memorize is this one back here, extensor digitorum. We've got to know extensor digitorum. It's the one that goes down into the fingers. That's how it got its name, extensor digitorum. If you know extensor digitorum, the one right next to it on the thumb side is extensor carpi radialis, and the one next to it on the pinky side, extensor carpi ulnaris. So, must be able to identify palmaris longus, must be able to identify extensor digitorum. If you can identify those things, you can find the others. They're just on the radius or the ulna side. And to help us keep track of extensor or flexor at the beginning of their name, remember what the movements look like at the wrist. When I flex the wrist, I'm pulling it forward. When I extend the wrist, I'm pulling it backwards. So your extensor muscles, extensor carpi ulnaris, is on the back side. Flexor carpi ulnaris is on the front. So we identified our muscles, and identifying our muscles helps us to predict their actions. Let me pause for a moment. I know I've got a couple of notes in the chat. If you have other questions you want to add, feel free to add them. Let me check out my chat. Yeah, so Ethel asked, when we flex the wrist joint, we're pulling the hand, we're pulling it closer to the radius and the ulna. So when we do flexion, the radius and the ulna, we're bringing the hand closer to those. You're pulling it together. A question about tomorrow's lab session. It will probably be similar to the one that we had for the midterm exam as well. That will be in the lab with some of those models being kind of talked through for you. So similar to that midterm review. Yeah, so Leela asked the kinds of questions that we're going to have on the final exam. It's going to be a mix of, I ask you to identify a muscle, and then I, on a different question, would ask you, what would the function of this muscle be? So similar to what we had on the homework assignments, where we said, this muscle lives on the front side of the body. So this muscle does flexion. Questions a lot like that. You can expect those kinds of questions on the final exam. And then also some questions where we've got the muscle man and there are 5 different muscles that have a letter on them. And we ask you, which one of these is palmaris longus? Which one of these is extensor digitorum? So we need to be able to identify the muscles. If you can identify them, you can use their location to tell you what their actions are. I'm going to be honest, Courtney, I'm not totally sure what hanging your wrist means. I'm not cool enough to know what that means. But if you're talking about when your fingers come closer to your radius and your ulna, if that's what that looks like, that would be correct. So flexion brings those bones closer together. So if got it. Okay, thank you, Courtney. Helping out your not athletic instructor here. So hanging your wrist, which is the follow through on a basketball shot. Absolutely. Yep. So when your hand rolls down, because we're bringing the fingers closer together. Yes, that is flexion. Yeah, and Ethel asked for clarification on extensor digitorum. Yes, extensor digitorum is the main muscle that we see here on the back. So you can see I drew on its little extensions going down into the hand. Extensors live on the back, and the big extensor that we can absolutely identify is extensor digitorum. And then extensor carpi ulnaris, extensor carpi radialis live next door to that one. Hey, while we are talking about these forearm muscles, the other movement that we need to know with these muscles is abduction and adduction. When we're predicting these kinds of movements on our muscles at these joints, we just need to remember what it looks like. So abduction is when you move your wrist up. So the thumb comes close to the radius and the ulna. Adduction is when our pinky comes closer to the radius and the ulna. We're adding our hand back toward the middle of the body. So when we're thinking about doing abduction and adduction at the wrist joint, the muscles that are going to help us do that live on different sides. So if you live out here on the thumb side, on the lateral side, this, by the way, is going to be flexor carpi radialis. We're on the thumb side. When this muscle contracts, it's going to pull the wrist toward the outside. The outside, the lateral side of the arm, is going to help me do abduction. If I live on the medial side, which would be, let's see, there's palmaris, this little friend right here next to palmaris. This is flexor carpi ulnaris. This is going to pull the hand more toward the middle. I live on the medial side, so I'm going to do adduction. So it's all about the locations. Flexor carpi radialis and flexor carpi ulnaris are lateral and medial to the palmaris longus muscle. So they help us to either move laterally, which is abduction, or move medially, which is adduction. That is all the muscle predictions that I wanted to do with you related to specific muscles. The one other thing I wanted to take a little bit of time to do in our review is to talk with you about that last activity that's been in your lab packet for the last 8 weeks, right? The picture of the skeleton where we get to do art. So we'll do a couple of that together to help you get ready for the final exam. But let me give us a moment for some more questions. If you have any other questions about movements, we can put those in the chat. Courtney is asking about the extensor muscles and the wrist. I cannot recall, let me check. Did we ask you to predict on the extensors? Let's see. We did not. Yeah, so no, for the sake of simplicity, no. The ones that attach on the backside are less able to do abduction and adduction. They're more about doing the extension back there. So for the sake of how we're studying, just know flexor carpi radialis and flexor carpi ulnaris. Will the final ask about your torso bending, like bending to touch your toes? That is, I think, one of the actions that we talked about predicting. We didn't cover it today in our session. So there were 2 kinds of movements we can do with the torso. The torso, either we can pull it forward, like Leela's asking about, bending down, like toward your toes. That's called forward flexion or anterior flexion. If I'm pulling, here, we'll go to our picture here. If we're talking about pulling the rib cage down to move it toward our toes, so all of this up here is going to move down toward your toes. For us to be able to pull the rib cage that direction, I need a muscle whose muscle fibers go that direction. So bending toward your toes is the job of rectus abdominis. That's the big one that goes up and down in the front of your abdominal pelvic cavity. So rectus abdominis pulls us forward because that's the direction of the movement. Its muscle fibers go the direction of the movement. When we talk about the oblique muscles, remember that the oblique muscles hang out on the sides and they go at an angle. So when we're talking about rotating or moving toward the side, that's going to be the job of the oblique muscles. So the rectus abdominis muscle pulls you forward to touch your toes. When we're rotating the torso side to side, that's the job of the oblique muscles, because that's the way that their muscles are set up. Any other questions about this before we move into origin insertion? I see that Ethel wants to talk about that, and I was definitely planning to talk about that. Okay, well, let's talk about the origin insertion activities, and let's talk about why you have so many of them to practice with. I am hoping that you know this, but if not, no time like the present to learn this. On the final exam, I am going to give you some pictures. We'll have some models in the classroom that are set up with it too. I'm going to give you some pictures of completely made up muscles. And what I'm going to give you on those pictures is a marking that tells you this is the origin of the muscle and this is the insertion of this muscle. I need you to tell me what this muscle does. And it's not going to be a real muscle, so there's not a way for you to memorize what this muscle does. We literally have to be able to make these predictions. To train you to make predictions like that, we've done a bunch of origin and insertion activities where you're getting used to seeing, here's some green dots, here's some blue dots. Can I use those dots to help me figure out what the movement is? So let's do a couple of these together so you get an idea of how to do that activity in your lab packet. And then I'll show you some examples of maybe the kinds of things you might expect to see on the lab final exam. So when we're doing the origin insertion activity, the last activity in your packets, we tell you that you need two colors. So the first color is blue. The things we're going to mark with blue are the origins of our muscles. And then you also need green. Green is the insertion of the muscle. Before we move on, when we talk about muscles having origins and having insertions, when a muscle contracts, only one of those locations actually moves. Is it the origin or the insertion of a muscle that actually moves when the muscle contracts? Do we know? Origin or insertion, who moves when a muscle contracts? Yeah, so maybe we didn't review this quite as much as we needed to in our lab classes. The thing that moves every time a muscle contracts is the part of the muscle called the insertion. That would be, I call these things with my students, I call it an underline highlight star idea. Something that I need you to write down if you don't already know this, because we need to make sure we know this. The insertion of a muscle is the attachment site that moves when that muscle contracts. The insertion is going to move toward the origin of the muscle. So when we're looking at these activities, we're going to make pictures of muscles, and we're going to see that one of the places or a couple of places it attaches are origins. Origins don't move when the muscle contracts. But other places it attaches will be insertions, and the insertions move toward the origin when the muscle contracts. So we just talked about rectus abdominis. Let's do that one together. Let me pull up my packet so I tell you the exact markings. Rectus abdominis was the first muscle that we had you do this activity with. So we are way back in the lesson number 7 packet, if you've got your lab packets with you, way back in lesson number 7. There on that last page of the packet, we tell you that the origin of the rectus abdominis muscle is the pubic crest and pubic symphysis of the pubic bones. So the pubic bones are the ones in the front. The pubic crest is the top of these bones. And in between the two halves of the pubic bones, there is that fibrocartilage called the pubic symphysis. This is my origin of the rectus abdominis muscle. Remind me again in the chat, I just drew the origin. The origin does or does not move when this muscle contracts. Does the origin move when a muscle contracts? Yeah, it does not. Okay, so when we're thinking about rectus abdominis, we're thinking about the six-pack muscle that goes across the top of your abdomen. That part, your hip bones, do not move when the muscle contracts. What does move is the insertion. So I'm going to switch colors here. The insertion of the rectus abdominis One of them is the xiphoid process of the sternum. That's this little end part right here. The xiphoid process of the sternum. Also, the costal cartilages of ribs 5 through 7. Costal cartilage is the cartilage at the ends of the ribs. We're just going to guesstimate because it doesn't matter if we're exactly right. We're going to assume that something like this is close to 5 to 7. We might be wrong. It's okay. Big picture, we know what we're doing here. So I've drawn my origin. I've drawn my insertion. Now I get to do connect the dots to make the rectus abdominis muscle. Here's the rectus abdominis muscle that goes up and down across my abdomen. Here's the big reason we need to do this activity. Now that we've drawn it, we can see the origin that doesn't move. We can see the insertion that does move. On you, especially now when we're at home, when no one can see us, now I need you to touch your origin and your insertion for this muscle and bring them closer together. The only way I can bring that insertion toward that origin is when I bend forward, when I'm bending toward my toes. What's moving is the rib cage, because that's the insertion. And the rib cage is moving forward. With this muscle, when we're taking the final exam, I might give you a picture of a muscle like this. And I'm going to ask you two things. I'm going to ask you, number one, does the rib cage move or does the pelvis move? That's what you see in your lab packet. I ask you, who's moving, the rib cage or the pelvis? And that's where we need to know that the insertion is what moves, not the origin. So the first thing we need to get out of each of these activities is what part of the body moves, the origin or the insertion. The insertion is the part that moves. The other thing we need to do is we need to be able to predict what kind of movement is going to happen. So to help us with making that predictions, let me see if I can find I think I want to try to do the deltoid with you, but let me see if I had us do deltoid before. We can do brachioradialis. All right, so we are in packet number 10, at the end of packet number 10. Brachioradialis is one of the muscles in your arm. So we're looking at one that goes from the humerus down to the radius. We're going to draw its origins and its insertions. So I'm going to get my blue pencil out again, and I'm going to start with its origins. So when we talk about the origin of the brachioradialis, it says it's right above the lateral epicondyle. Lateral epicondyle is a bump on the outside, on the lateral side of the humerus. So up here would be about the location of my lateral epicondyle. So brachioradialis is going to attach somewhere right above here. My origin, the lateral epicondyle of the humerus. My insertion is the styloid process of the radius. So the styloid process of the radius is the part that you can feel in your arm. When you bend your hand backwards and you feel on the arm side of your bones, not on the hand side, but on the arm side, you can feel the styloid process sticking out. I'm going to do some connect the dots now. Build me a brachioradialis. Now, here's where we make our predictions about movements. So again, I want you at home, no one can see you. I want you to put your hand on the styloid process. I want you to put your hand on that lateral epicondyle, feel where these markings are, and then we're going to work on bringing them closer together. When we bring them closer together, at least on me, I'm pulling my forearm forward. That's the way I get them as close as possible. I can pull my hand all the way up. Like I can make it touch my humerus. It's not going to meet that lateral epicondyle, but it's going to be a lot closer when I'm hugging my arm up there. So this is a muscle that helps me to bring my forearm forward. Let's pull together some of the words that we were talking about at the very beginning. We talked about how moving this arm forward decreased the angle at the elbow joint. When I pull my palm forward, is that flexion or extension? What is it called when I pull my whole forearm forward? Is that flexion or extension? Yeah, a couple of us agree. When the forearm comes forward and the angle gets smaller, that's flexion. So at the elbow joint, brachioradialis brings the bones closer together. When it brings them closer together, it's doing flexion. So we should know that this muscle, number one, it moves the radius and the ulna, because that's the part where there's the green dot, right? The part with the green dot means that that's the insertion. That's the moving part. We should also know that when the radius and the ulna move, they go toward the humerus. They're going toward the origin. So what moves is the radius and the ulna, and when it moves, it does flexion. On the final exam, you are going to see stations that look like this. Draw one that looks a lot like what we just did, but not quite. Let's do this. So we're going to come to a station and we're going to see one of these muscles. It's not going to be, there's not going to be more than one. Each station will only have one. And it's going to be color coded. And I'm going to tell you that the blue dots are the origins and the green dots are the insertions. We're going to see stuff like this. And I'm going to ask you to tell me what kind of movement would happen at that joint. The first half of your answer for that question is who moves. So if I go through, let me get a black pen here. If I go through station by station, we start with our first muscle that we see right here. If I'm asking you who moves at this station, are you going to tell me the humerus or the ulna? If this is your muscle at that station, who's going to be moving? The humerus or the ulna? Good. Yep, we're recognizing my insertion is on the ulna. So the ulna is who's moving. That's half the question. The other half of the question is going to be what movement are we doing? Your options are going to be flexion or extension. And this is when, again, you need to feel these bone markings on you, bring them closer together. When I bring them closer together, the way that works, like we're saying in the chat, this would be a muscle that flexes the ulna. Hey, let's go over to this station over here. If I'm asking you who moves at this station, is that going to be the clavicle or the humerus? Who moves at this station? Yeah, the humerus moves at this station because it's got the insertion on it. The clavicle has the origin, it's not moving. Okay, I can ask you a couple of different movement words on this one. First, I can ask you, would this do flexion or extension? Can we tell? Would this do flexion or extension? What do we think? So we feel on ourselves the clavicle, we feel on ourselves the humerus. When I try to bring the clavicle or bring the humerus closer to the clavicle, I'm bringing my humerus forward. The humerus is going toward the clavicle. That's going to be flexion. When the humerus moves forward, that's flexion. The other movement that could potentially be done at this joint, would this be abduction or adduction? Abduction or adduction? Yeah, so for this one, we're going to have to feel the way this joint works. I've got my humerus sticking out. So I'm literally doing this with you here at home. So put your arm out in anatomical position. Feel that spot that we've labeled the insertion. Feel your clavicle. When I'm bringing that spot on your humerus toward your clavicle, the humerus comes up. That's the way I can get them the closest together. I'm pulling the humerus up. So when I pull the humerus up, that is abduction. If I wanted it to be adduction, what I would need to do is change my insertion. Let me see if I can get it to show up on here. Change my insertion to the backside or to the underside of the humerus. If you attach to the medial side of the humerus, when you pull on it, you pull it in. But notice that this muscle I made up attaches to the outside of the humerus. Because it attaches on the outside, it does abduction. It's the same deal actually down here. Let me get my black back here. Same deal with this muscle right here. See how I'm attached on the lateral aspect on the outside of the femur down here? Since I'm attached on the outside of the femur, I'm going to pull the femur this direction. This is going to be another abductor. The other thing that this muscle would do is this muscle would also pull my femur forward. What is that called when I pull the femur forward? So when the femur comes forward, it gets closer to the bones of the hip. Because it's getting closer to the bones of the hip, we would call that flexion. So this muscle would abduct the femur, and it would also flex the femur. This muscle down here is one that moves the tibia. When it moves the tibia, it's going to pull this insertion back toward itself, which means this is going to pull the tibia forward. Here's my knee joint when I'm sitting down. When this muscle does its work, my knee looks like this. Here's my little foot. We'll add a little foot. There's the patella. When this muscle contracts, my leg looks like this. Would this muscle be a flexor or an extender? We go from this angle to this angle. Flexor or extensor when the tibia comes forward. Yeah, exactly. When the tibia comes forward, it's extension. When the femur comes forward, it's flexion. With activities like this, again, the best way to prepare for this kind of question on the exam is to go through and do those activities that are in each of your lab packets. Not only are you going to review the location of bone markings, because that's what bone markings are for, muscle attachment. So you're going to review your bone markings. We're going to color code them blue or green. Then we need to practice making predictions. Feel those blue and green spots on yourself. Try to bring those blue and green spots together. When you do that, it will help you to be able to make these kinds of predictions on the final exam. Yeah, so Courtney's asking to repeat our rules for the hip and the knee. Absolutely. I'm going to use this skeleton here from the side to help us out. When we're talking about flexion and extension at the hip joint and at the knee joint, they are opposite of each other. That's what makes them tricky. When I flex at the hip joint, when I flex my femur, flexing my femur looks like this, flexing the femur. When I extend my femur, looks like this, extend the femur. When we go down to the knee joint to bring things back together, flexing the tibia looks like pulling it closer to the femur, but I'm pulling it backwards. So flexing the tibia moves the tibia backwards. Extending the tibia means pulling it forwards. Extending the tibia. Does that help clarify it a little bit, Courtney? I like it. Yeah. So Leela is using the analogy of folding things to touch other things. I like that. So when I fold things together to get them to touch, that is flexion. So flexion, when we're doing the femur, we're trying to get it to touch the pelvis. Flexion, making the femur touch the pelvis. When we're trying to get the tibia to touch something, we're trying to get it to touch the femur. And the way that it does that is by flexing toward the backside. Yeah, so Courtney's asking, can we relate this back to a ball? Absolutely. When you kick a ball, if you're just using your tibia to kick that ball, we are extending the tibia to kick the ball. If you're using your entire leg to kick the ball, we are flexing the femur to move your whole leg forward, and then we extend the tibia all the way out. So kicking the ball is flexing your thigh and extending the lower part called the leg, or extending the tibia. That is correct, Courtney. Yep. So when I kick a ball, I flex my leg and I extend the tibia. Absolutely correct. Any other questions? So Leela, I'm not totally sure what you mean by asking about contractions. That's kind of, when we were talking about the actions, that's kind of what we were doing, was talking about what happens in muscle contractions. Can you clarify for me what you mean by that? I'll mention if you're referring to the sarcomere model, that will be covered in tomorrow's review session. Toss that out. So Hannah's asking a question about prime movers, agonists, antagonists, synergists. Be familiar with that terminology. What I will say is, as long as we know that a prime mover, which is a synonym for an agonist, as long as we know that that is who primarily does an action, and we know that an antagonist is the muscle that does the opposite action, you can predict those things. So we're not asking you in the lab packets to go through and identify specific agonists and antagonists of actions. But if you know that I live on the front, and if I live on the front, I do flexion, you would know that the antagonist muscle to that muscle is the one that lives on the back. So if you live on the opposite side of a bone,
you're the antagonist to me. That's really the extent of what we need to know about prime movers and antagonists. If you know what one side does, you can predict what the other side does. It does the opposite. Okay, so Leela is asking about what so predicting muscle actions. That's kind of what we were doing right here. So she asked, how do we know what a muscle does? Really, it comes down to acting it out on yourself, or getting, thinking about the other way you can get around acting it out. If you feel like you can't act it out, would be to consider if any of our muscle movement rules apply. Because technically, when we were looking at, for example, when we looked at this muscle right here, technically this muscle falls under the rules that we talked about. If you live on the front side of the arm, you're going to flex the radius and the ulna. Or when we were talking about this one up here doing abduction, if you attach on the lateral side of the bone, you're going to do abduction. Or if you attach on the medial side, you're going to do adduction. So if acting out the movements is hard for you and you can't put those words together, make sure you have those rules memorized, because you can use those rules to help you with these kinds of prediction questions as well. So consider that, making sure you know those rules inside and out. You can apply them even to these fake muscles that we're going to make up for you on the exam. So a clarifying question about the hip joint and the knee joint. Overall, very correct statement that the hip joint and the knee joint are opposite. That is correct. So you flex the femur forward, you flex the tibia backwards. You extend the femur backwards, and you extend the tibia forwards. So if you just memorize that they're opposites and you know what happens with the femur, that should be enough for you to predict what it looks like on the tibia. So that'd be another approach we could take. Yeah, so Leela's asking, we can do multiple different kinds of movements during a contraction. Yes, that is correct. That's why when we were talking about some of these muscles that we labeled, some of them will do something like abduction and also flexion, or adduction and also extension. So that's where the idea that we mentioned of agonists or prime movers and synergists comes into play. Prime movers can make something happen, but then they work with other muscles to maybe slightly change what happens. So if the adductor muscle is acting by itself, it will adduct the femur. But if the adductor muscle is working with another muscle that lives on the front of your thigh, it's more likely to help you with flexion. So it is correct that muscles can do more than one movement, depending on who they're working with. That's why the approach to learning your muscle movements that I totally advocate for you, learn what the movements look like and learn who lives where, because then you can predict the full range of what they do. You can predict if this is one that helps with flexion or extension. You can predict that this is one that helps with abduction or adduction. Ethel is asking about when the recording will be available. It's going to depend a lot on how kind YouTube is to me. I'm hoping to get it pushed out to my instructors no later than tomorrow. So I will emphasize with the instructors to get it out to you as soon as it's available, and I'll try to get it to them as soon as possible. And then there's a question about the bone marking review. Yes, I'll put in the chat that website one more time so that we can access that, and I'll make sure that I pass that out to the instructors as well. All right, well, I appreciate you all tracking with me. I know that it's a lot of information. My hope in today's session is that you have seen that maybe I don't need to memorize all of the muscle actions. Maybe I can just predict at least some of them. The more that we can find material like this where you can predict it, the more space you can save in your mind for stuff that you just have to memorize, like the locations of muscles, like the functions of cranial nerves, like some of those things that we just have to memorize. So please try to use the rules to make predictions. Remember that you've got a lot of review assignments to get you ready for the final exam. Do those assignments as many times as possible until you can complete them without referencing your notes. It'll help you not only to know what you need to keep studying, but help you to know what kinds of questions you can expect on the exam. So good luck with your studying. I'm going to go ahead and end the recording, and I'll stick around for a couple minutes if we have any last minute questions.